Well, my background is in sociology. I was a sociologist as an undergraduate, studied Pentecostalism, went to Sri Lanka, became a Buddhist monk for a while, and tried to decide if I was going to be a Buddhist scholar. Came back to sociology, and then started doing the sociology of bioethics, was teaching bioethics at the University of Chicago. And that's where I encountered the futurists, the extropians, the transhumanists, and got excited by their ideas. In the 2000s, became executive director of the World Transhumanist Association. And that's also when we started the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which I continued to run. I started that with Nick Bostrom back in 2005, and it has grown since then. So most of the things I will be talking about come out of that experience, the World Transhumanist and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and as I'll explain, it has become more relevant than one might think because of the people in corridors of power who have passed through or who have drunk from our cup, and I will talk about their contributions and their politics. Okay, so the basic thing, I want to start with a discussion about the idea of TESCREAL, which I'll unpack, and why I think it's a conspiracy theory and what a more systemic analysis of futurist ideas would look like. And then I will talk about the evolution of technopolitics as I see it over the last 250 years, and what a techno-progressive point of view is, and a left futurist point of view. And then how I think techno-progressive or left futurist perspective contributes to our understanding the crisis of social democracy and the crisis of democracy in general, and how to move forward in this century. So that's the basic outline of my comments. And I'll start by saying that I usually start talking about transhumanism or futurist ideas by saying that I don't think this is anything new, that as soon as we as a species were capable of abstract thinking, as soon as we were capable of thinking of, wouldn't it be better if we could do something, that people started to imagine what it would be like to have bodies that did not get sick and old, to have more wisdom, more capability to understand the divine, but also have societies without hunger, without conflict, societies that were better than the ones they lived in. And back then, when we started to imagine those things, society and technology changed very slowly. We probably mastered fire 1 million, 2 million years ago, but only 50,000 years ago began to come up with the more abstract kinds of symbolic thought that allowed us to do more sophisticated things, and then eventually invented literacy, and that accelerated things. But we projected, through all that time, we projected our visions of what could be onto religious, what we now call religious or spiritual projects. We talked about immortality that our ancestors had, or that we would have after death, or that they have over the next hill in a more perfect village, the peace and prosperity of a fabled past. This little picture is a picture of Shangri-La, one of the, or Shambhala in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, the idea of a mythical kingdom that is perfect in every way. And in Buddhism, we talk about the Pure Land, which is, if you're lucky, you could be reborn in a place where there's everything is perfect, and it completely supports our desire to become enlightened. So we've always had these visions in our societies, but the methods that we were told that we would use to achieve these ends were magical or spiritual. And you begin to see the transition happen with European alchemy, for instance, the kind of alchemy being liminal between older religious ideas of self-perfection and newer scientific ideas. But when we finally get to the Enlightenment 250 years ago, then we had a variety of ideas being offered in the Enlightenment moment. And one of them was scientific materialism, science, the faith in progress, technological advance, and so forth. And those ideas were suggested as alternative ways to achieve these spiritual goals. Now, many of the people who were proposing these were also religious. They believed in gods and God. But they thought that the better way to achieve these goals would be through scientific and materialist methods. They also proposed a more scientific way of thinking about the future. The way that we had been thinking about the future was deeply eschatological and teleological. We thought that there was a particular future that was expected, and that everything was moving towards that future. I think one of the challenges that we've had since the Enlightenment is how to think about the future as probabilities, not as a certainty of one particular outcome or another, but that there's a range of possibilities and that we should try to figure out what that range is and move towards the best possible future. So for me, transhumanism is deeply rooted in the Enlightenment tradition and Enlightenment humanism. On the emphasis of the Enlightenment on rational thought, empiricism, scientism, and the ability to perfect the human condition that came out of the Enlightenment. And as technology began to change society more rapidly, I think it became clear that we needed to be very clear about our expectations about the future. We needed to go beyond just eschatological or teleological views, and think about what technology was going to do to our future. For me, imbibing deeply from Marxism, this was clearly one of the central motivators for Marx and Engels to try to think about how our technological future would evolve and what kinds of prospects for more equality, more health and good things in the future might be, given those technological advances. And so you can see out of the Enlightenment, you can see many different movements combining these elements. Some, like Marxist-Leninism, let individual liberty more or less go by the wayside. They were more focused on the egalitarian and collective aspects of Enlightenment thought and the techno-optimism. Others were more focused on the political values, the kind of pastoral Luddite tradition of Enlightenment thought, the thought that was critical of science, the narrative of progress. That is also an Enlightenment point of view. Our post-World War II deep postmodernist deconstruction of the Enlightenment is based on Enlightenment ideas. It's that we should respect difference. All of these are Enlightenment ideas as well. So I see the flowering of post-Enlightenment thought as a kind of ideological alchemy, the taking of a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mixing it together. And the kind of alchemy that I'm going to propose is to put together the social democratic version of Enlightenment politics with the techno-optimist version of transhumanist futurism, and to reject other extremes like Marxist-Leninism and neoliberalism. So again, it's a probabilistic view. It's not a teleological view. I think this is, and I'll get to this point in a second about what a techno-progressive point of view is, but often those of us who believe that there can be emancipatory or liberatory possibilities of technology and the future are accused of being apologetics for capitalism or authoritarianism or whatever people worry about. When we are saying, no, this technology is not, the technology of, for instance, surveillance. The technology of surveillance could, if an authoritarian government comes to power, it could probably buy from China the latest surveillance technology and apply it in 3 months. So saying you as a society are not going to adopt a particular technology because you worry that it will enable bad things in the future is backwards thinking. And so I'll try to explicate the idea that if we're worried about the kind of future that we're going to have, that yes, we do partly have to worry about the kinds of technologies that we create, but that the question is far more political than technological. I'm also going to talk about the fact that a lot of our future thinking is still deeply inscribed by our personal biases, our class biases, our gender biases, and by the God-shaped hole in our culture, the religious eschatologies and teleologies. Some people, when they talk about technology, even though they are purportedly secular, they will talk about them in ways that are distinctly religious, about the fact that the artificial general intelligence will fulfill all of our needs or destroy us all. These are distinctly religious ways to interpret our future possibilities. And it's not to say that both of those things aren't possible, right? That's the probabilistic view. There may be some possibility of catastrophe or existential risk, and there may be some possibility of utopian possibilities. And once we understand appropriately that range, we can try to steer towards the more utopian and away from the existential risk. So that's the kind of empirical futurism that I think we need. Now, this idea of TESCREAL has been promoted recently by a person who was part of the futurist community, Emil Torres, and a woman who was an ethicist, a tech ethicist who worked for Google briefly. And both of them, a couple of years ago, began to have a series of criticisms of the futurist ideas that people in Silicon Valley in particular were bringing to the table, people like Musk and Peter Thiel. And they gave a label to the set of ideas that they were worried about. They called it TESCREAL, and it stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. Now, these ideas do have a certain lineage. There are some connections between them. But if you've ever seen the classic meme of a conspiracy theorist of a giant board with strings between all the pins on the board, this is a way to approach ideological history that is extremely flexible, because everybody is connected to everybody else one way or another. And the question is, what do you think all these things had in common? Besides, this person went from here to there and carried these ideas over there. Do they actually have the same idea? Is there any real ideological continuity? So just briefly, transhumanism is the idea that we can have human enhancement technologies and that people should probably have a right to use technologies that transcend the human condition. Extropians were a flavor of transhumanists who mixed that with anarcho-capitalism and liberal economics in general. Singularitarians are people who think that there is a quickly approaching point in history where artificial general intelligence will profoundly change the human condition, possibly end the human condition. And so they're very focused on that kind of millennial expectation. Cosmists were Russian, mostly Eastern Orthodox, and then Bolshevik futurists who wanted to resurrect the dead. Rationalists, again, have some connection to pre-existing ideas like transhumanism, but for the most part, rationalists in Silicon Valley, as it's rationalism not as a philosophical movement, but as a Silicon Valley phenomenon, they were people who thought human beings aren't rational enough and needed to work on our cognitive biases. The effective altruists were overlapped with the rationalist community, but the effective altruists, like Peter Singer, argued that we needed to have more rational ways of approaching our normative commitments and our charity. And the long-termists were people like Nick Bostrom, who were trying to think about, well, given that I think that we're going to live 1 billion years, what should the interests of human beings 1 billion years from now be? And so all of these ideas, yes, they have some sociological connections to each other. But I have argued before they started to work on these things and after they started to work on their attack on test realism, that these are not the same ideas, right? The connection between these ideas is like the connection between Judaism and Christianity. Yes, there is a connection between Judaism and Christianity, or Hinduism and Buddhism, but they are not the same ideas. And in some ways, they are diametrically opposed ideas. And B, if, again, as with Judaism and Christianity, to say Judaism and Christianity are the same thing and they're reactionary. That's just bad intellectual history. There have been progressive things that came out of both Judaism and Christianity. There are left and right wings of every ideological movement for the most part. And to ignore those ideological differences is to do the work of the right, I would argue. To say that all of these ideas, that no leftist should ever think about whether future unborn people have rights or interests. That's long-termism. The environmentalists are arguing that we should be thinking about climate refugees in 2100, right? That is a moral obligation on our part. So if you say it's reactionary to think about people who aren't born yet and their interests, I don't see how that's good for left politics. So we have argued that the problem, we being me and other people interested in meeting the TechScreel critique toe-to-toe, we have argued that really the problem is the influence of actual fascists within these communities and of billionaires, and especially of billionaire fascists, people like Epstein, who turned out to be a billionaire fascist, who was funding some transhumanist endeavors, Peter Thiel, funding some transhumanist endeavors, and involved in some of these other communities as well. And so that we are countering this conspiracy theory about futurism on the same grounds that people have countered anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which argued that the Jews were not only conspiring through being Jewish bankers, but also being Jewish communists. And the Jewish bankers and the Jewish communists had something in common, their Judaism, and that they were both leading to the downfall of Western Christendom or whatever. That's the socialism of fools. That's the idea that you have identified some identifying feature of the people that you're opposed to, and that feature, if we could just defeat that feature, we would defeat the system. That's wrong, right? The way to defeat a system is to identify the system. The system in this case is the distorting power of billionaire wealth on the field of ideas. Just to say another word about eugenics and fascism before I talk about technofascism. Eugenics was, as I'm sure you are all aware, an extremely diverse phenomenon. Here in the United States, there were liberal ministers who were eugenicists because they thought it would be good for public health. The Margaret Sanger and some of the founders of reproductive rights or of feminism were eugenicists because they thought that promoting family planning and birth control was good for women. Eugenics was a very flexible set of ideas. And after World War II, when it became a bête noire. Then it became a football as well, a floating signifier for a variety of other projects. Prenatal testing is often accused of being eugenic on the grounds that giving parents the ability to know the contents of the mother's womb and make a decision about whether to continue a pregnancy is eugenic. I do not consider state coercion and state murder to be in the same category as individual reproductive decision-making, free liberal decision-making. So I have been reluctant to engage with the way that the term eugenics has been used. But this is another term that many people who are critical of futurist ideas, for instance, long-termism. Long-termism is a very tiny philosophical set of people who write about long-termism. But if you're concerned about the future of the human race, you might be concerned that we seem to have decided not to have babies anymore, because that might mean that we would stop existing as a species. There are other possibilities. But to say that it is eugenic to observe that populations are shrinking is, I think, mistaken, right? This is simply a demographic fact. It's a futurist observation. It shapes the future that we will live in. What we do about it may be eugenic. It may be that some people propose eugenic measures in order to address the birth dearth. But I don't think it's eugenic just to talk about it. Similarly, fascism is certainly a floating signifier for a large group of reactionary political views. I am more concerned about the specificity at this point. I'm happy to call Trump, Modi, Orban, Putin. I'm happy to call them all fascists. I think they do share connections to a political project of neo-authoritarianism, neo-patriarchy, and so forth. But really the threat, I think, at this point is some new form of fascism, which is centered on the technocratic power of billionaire wealth. So I call this technofascism. The billionaires who are preparing for the rapid changes which they are contributing to create, the demographic changes, widespread unemployment, climate destruction, potentially wars. And they are, I think, especially concerned about the fact that new emerging technologies will dramatically change the balance of power in our society. It will enable individuals and small groups to wage terrorist campaigns, for instance, with these new technologies. And they, like Xi in China, look towards this tumultuous future and think that the way to prepare for it is to tighten the screws on public control and to prepare their own escape hatches. And when I'll talk in a second about the World Transhumanist Association, but just say that when Peter Thiel started to take over the world, Peter Thiel and his acolytes began to take over the World Transhumanist Association, one of the first things that they wanted us to focus on was seasteading, the idea that transhumanists should all want to live on independent colonies on cruise ships in the middle of the Pacific where we could conduct illegal medical experiments. They gave up on that idea, and now they just buy citizenship in New Zealand, which they've determined is the safest place to ride out the apocalypse. But the other decision that I think the tech billionaires have made in the last couple of years, especially in reaction to the Biden administration, unfortunately, was that they would have better prospects in an alliance with blood and soil fascists, with religious fundamentalists, and with patriarchal restoration. And I emphasize the patriarchal restoration because I think one of the themes that is most universal to the emerging neo-fascism around the world is a rejection of women's power, rejection of individual reproductive choice, a rejection of gender choice. Transgender people have become the symbol of the erosion of patriarchy around the world and the reassertion of strong man, strong man fascism has been especially reassertion of patriarchy. At any rate, what are the components of a techno-fascism? Total surveillance state. Clearly, the construction of Palantir, again, owned by Peter Thiel, has been, they are very explicit about the fact that they want us all to be better behaved by being under total surveillance. That surveillance will involve facial recognition. It will involve traceable IDs. It will involve everything, putting together every piece of information the state has about you into one big searchable database. It is classic fascism in the sense that it is also corporatism, the combining of state and corporate power. Now, I've referenced China here. I mean, if I had my druthers, I'd rather have the Chinese version of this, which is that Xi decided that he was not going to allow Peter Thiel's and Elon Musk's to push him around. And so he put Jack Ma in a box and decided that the unification of state and corporate power in China would have more state and less corporate. Here in the United States, we have more corporate and less state, but we still have been doing the same project. The fact that Trump has decided that he can start nationalizing industry in mid-negotiation without consultation with anyone. He's just going to tell corporations, now we own 10% of you. What better example of the neo-corporatism that we're pursuing is there? You know that Elon Musk's grandfather ran Technocracy Incorporated in Canada, and the technocrats, the technocracy movement, was a movement that was quasi-fascist, quasi-socialist. They were people who did not want to go the Marxist-Leninist route for a planned economy, but believed that scientists should run everything, just not communist scientists. And that vision of technocracy, I think, is, of course, very validating for a billionaire inventor who says, we're the smartest people on the planet, so we should run everything. That's clearly part of their agenda. I think there's also preference algorithms, the kind of idea that surveillance capitalism involves knowing so much about the public that you can predict what they want and manipulate what they want. That kind of preference algorithm to replace democratic deliberation. And actually, the Chinese Communist Party has been relatively explicit that you don't need to have competitive political debate and competitive political parties in order to aggregate public desire, that the state can just monitor all the communications and preference algorithms can do the rest of the work in terms of figuring out what people want and need and then manipulating it if they want something they shouldn't. And of course, militaristic nationalism, militaristic imperialism. The Silicon Valley has its roots in the US Defense Department, the defense spending of the 1960s, but it has returned big time after a couple decades when we thought that there might be some resistance on the part of Google, just be good kind of ethics. They have all decided, all the big tech players decided that not only are they on board with MAGA, but they're on board with the rearmament and re-imperialism of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So this is what I talk about when I talk about techno-fascism. I'm also going to be talking about, however, as a response to this, what I call the techno-progressive ideas, the techno-progressive movement. And we met in 2014 in Paris at a transhumanist meeting, but we had been discussing for months before that about the need to respond to Peter Thiel and others who were creating a public impression, and I think it's now quite well established, this public impression that transhumanism is reactionary, if not fascist. And we wanted to put back on the table our vision of what the project is with the Techno-Progressive Declaration. So I've got some quotes from the Techno-Progressive Declaration scattered throughout this talk. And this is part of what we said. We said we are partisans of the promises of the Enlightenment, and we have many cousins in other movements for freedom and social justice. And we must build solidarity with those movements, even as we intervene to point to the radical possibilities of technologies that they often ignore. So I see the response to these techno-fascist ideas, which incorporate some Enlightenment ideas as well, to propose instead the Enlightenment idea of individual liberty, liberté, égalité, fraternité, of democratic deliberation being the basis of the legitimacy of a state, of vast inequalities of wealth and power not being compatible with a democratic society. And I think that we have many, many cousins who share those aspects of that vision, which I'll talk about in a second. So to go back to futurism, as I said, for me, Marxism is one statement. Early sociology, I mean, Comte and Saint-Simon and all the early sociologists were also people who were trying to say, this is where we see industrialization headed, and what this is the kind of communal life that we hope for from industrialization. And so in retrospect, I am much more sympathetic with the Marxist Promethean vision that technology is something that opens the realm of human possibility. It doesn't guarantee, and I don't think a good interpretation of Marx would say that it guarantees anything, but it doesn't guarantee a certain direction, but it opens the possibility, and there may be certain internal dynamics that will lead in certain directions. Denis Diderot, one of my favorites, who wrote about the possibility of artificial intelligence in his only letters that were only posthumously published, but he was thinking about not only legalization of homosexuality, but also the idea of making harpsichords that could think. Marquis de Condorcet, who died at the hands of the Jacobins, but who was still optimistic enough that we as a species could defeat monarchy, patriarchy, slavery, and death and toil. J.B.S. Haldane, H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley, people in the 20th century who were Marxists, socialists of various sorts, H.G. Wells being one of the more future-oriented Fabian socialists, who also thought that we at least had the possibility of creating a better future because of technological advance. Now, I think one of the things that, if you have ever looked at, or if you're curious about Citizen Cyborg, I have this chart in Citizen Cyborg and its various iterations. And this is my attempt to think through whether the elective affinities of transhumanist futurism in particular had a particular elective affinity to a particular kind of politics or not. And I did argue in Citizen Cyborg that technology is a third dimension of politics added to the cultural and economic dimensions. I thought, well, I see that there are specific individuals around who are tech fascists or tech populists, who are tech conservatives, who are tech social democrats, and there are Luddites in all those corners as well. There are people who are opposed to technology, who are social democrats and populists and libertarians. And so there didn't seem to be a strong elective affinity. I think the evidence of the last 20 years is that I was wrong, that there is, in fact, a strong elective affinity between science and technology optimism and the liberalism, cultural liberalism. If you believe that the changes that will be wrought by emerging technologies are acceptable, if you have a very low future shock gag reflex, then you're probably also a cultural liberal. You're probably also someone who's not freaked out by women having rights and transgender people being able to exist and immigrants being able to be in your society and all the other things. And so I think that this table pretty much explains where we're at, that there may be people on the far right who think that technologies will selectively enable their eugenic or their authoritarian visions, but that in general, an openness to technological innovation is associated with the cultural liberal end of the spectrum. And at that cultural liberal end, there are libertarians as well as social democrats, and as well as Marxist Leninists and other kinds of people as well. And so when I was in charge of the World Transhumanist Association, this was the principal problematic that we had. Let's see, this is the, I will change my, okay, there we go. This is surveys that I did of the politics of the World Transhumanist Association when I was running it, 2003 to 2007, and the various political labels that people in the transhumanist movement, about 5,000 people responded to these surveys, the various labels that they applied to themselves. And you can see that a third to almost half, depending on the survey, identified with left-leaning labels, about 20% identified with libertarian labels or minarchist labels. Randian objectivism was another flavor. Some advocated other political systems that didn't fit into these categories, and very, very few advocated for Christian democracy or conservatism or the far right. The people who were libertarians, the minarchists, they for the most part were clustered around what was called extropianism, which is a part of the TESCREAL thing that people were attacking. And the extropians started around 1988 as the first organized transhumanist group, explicitly transhumanist group in the world. And of course, shortly after that, the internet and email lists got going, and they became an international phenomenon. I met them first on their email list. They were explicitly anarcho-capitalist. And so I didn't have much to say to them at first, because as soon as I started to talk about my political ideas, they weren't interested. But shortly after that, I discovered Nick Bostrom, Anders Sandberg, Swedes who were liberals in Sweden, but Swedish liberals are still social democrats everywhere else. And most of the rest of the World Transhumanist Association at the time was at least politically Catholic in the sense that they were open to social democratic and left-wing ideas. But as a consequence of involving both people who thought that the state was illegitimate, that there should be no state, and people who thought that the state should be much stronger, like people on the left, we didn't have much to say or couldn't get to the point of saying much about what kinds of public policy we should have. So eventually, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies got started because we wanted to have the people who agreed that there should be a state, that it should be democratic, and that it should provide for basic goods for everyone. Those people hived off and created our own thing called the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. And after a couple of years, we started to call ourselves techno-progressives, or to call that project the Techno-Progressive Project. And the French transhumanists have always been the closest to the techno-progressive ideas. Their other label is Technoprog. But the ideas that have been involved in techno-progressivism since 2005 or so have ranged from technocracy as one of the ideas, but also Marxist-Leninism, to anti-fascist liberals or various kinds of social liberals, one sort or another. This is a survey I did of the IET community of people who explicitly identified with the term techno-progressive. And I asked, well, what other political ideas do you identify with other than techno-progressive? And you can see progressive is a very popular one, anti-racist, green, feminist, upwinger, Democrat, so forth. In general, abortion rights, environmentalism, dignity in dying, the ability to control when you die, disability rights, secular humanism, drug legalization. And the next year we met in Paris, as I said, and adopted the Techno-Progressive Declaration to try to make those ideas explicit. Now, another thing that happened after we met in Paris that year was that people went back home and said, well, we need to get more political. And this was before I think it was clear that the real crisis that we faced was a crisis of democracy, that liberal democracy itself was being called into question. But people thought, well, we'll start political parties. And despite having just said, we need to call them something more specific than transhumanist, most of the projects that people engaged in were transhumanist projects, and many of them were libertarian projects. So Zoltan Istvan came back and ran for president in 2016 as a transhumanist, and he drove this coffin-shaped bus around. And I've described Zoltan as basically transhumanist performance art. He was fairly successful at getting some notoriety for his campaign. And he wasn't terribly interested in running a political party, but he did birth what continues to persist as the US Transhumanist Party, which is primarily a libertarian party, a techno-futurist version of libertarian politics. The British tried to organize a transhumanist party, and it did not get very far because at that meeting, they had both libertarians, techno-progressives, and the far right. And of course, as we'd already discovered with the World Transhumanist Association, those three groups cannot come to agreement about very much. And so the UK version, the French version, the Spanish versions, they all basically died on the vine, because unless you define a clear politics, then this doesn't go very far. And most transhumanists aren't very clear about their politics. But I'll come back to the prospect of our political engagement later. I would say the most successful political engagement that perhaps not transhumanists, but the children and grandchildren of the transhumanist community have had is that billionaires like Musk did put some money behind existential risks, and especially the effective altruist community decided that one of the biggest risks to the future of humanity was out of control artificial intelligence. And so they began to fund both academic and policy work on artificial intelligence regulation, and also set up OpenAI. I mean, OpenAI and Anthropic were both established by people who were coming out of the existential risk and effective altruist communities, and who thought that artificial general intelligence was a profound risk and needed to be controlled. I would say they were profoundly successful. There were more than 100 funded artificial intelligence risk experts embedded in the US Congress in the Biden administration. People who, not under Biden, but during the Biden administration, people who were advising congressional committees and congresspeople about artificial intelligence. I think that was wonderful work. I may not have agreed with all of the solutions that they were coming up with or their political orientation, but to get more people thinking about those kinds of things was excellent. However, as you may remember, 2 years ago, the push came to shove within OpenAI, when people who were coming out of the effective altruist and existential risk community were on the board of directors of OpenAI. And they got pissed off at Sam Altman for constantly lying to them and starting things without telling them that they were going to start. And they thought that some of the evidence that was coming out of ChatGPT was already of concern, and they wanted to slow things down, and fired Sam Altman. And immediately, Microsoft and Sam Altman's allies and the employees at OpenAI said, no, we'll walk with Sam, and because we like those billions of dollars. We see the promise, and we see the risk, and we want the promise. We want the billions. It turned out that OpenAI had already aligned AI. It had already aligned it with capital. Capital is calling the tune for the development of AI. So I think it's been very interesting to me that a lot of the effective accelerationists out there who legitimately worried about the future of artificial intelligence, they have suddenly discovered, like people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, they've suddenly discovered, wait a minute, capitalism is the problem here, because capitalism is what's driving our system and preventing us from enacting the kinds of regulation of risk that we need. Now, the other thing that was happening, of course, in the last decade, started before this, but it has been very clear in the last decade, is the crisis of liberal and social democracy, which not very many people saw clearly, but Peter Thiel, at least, saw these things happening and started to opine about the how bad democracy was back. He first wrote that more than a decade ago, and began to cultivate their own neo-authoritarian leaders. In Thiel's case, not only was he giving money to various transhumanist causes and undermining the transhumanist movement with his philanthropy, but he started to buy politicians, in particular, J.D. Vance, who is poised to become the next president of the United States, and promoting various of their ideas, strongman, authoritarian nationalist ideas. Also, we've seen in the last decade the rise of anti-science populism. So if you go back to that box that I showed, where the science optimism or science belief is associated with the cultural liberals, it's also associated with higher education, which I'll get to in a second. But the people on the populist right who have less education have become increasingly anti-science. Now, this goes back, of course, to the Enlightenment. It goes back to the fight between scientism and Voltaire and the church and so forth, and then evolution and whether we should teach evolution in the schools and those kinds of things. But in the last decade, and especially since COVID, there has been a deepening, a hardening of anti-science populist attitudes on the right. So I've already mentioned the World Transhumanist Association. Peter Thiel began his philanthropy of the World Transhumanist Association in the late 2000s and began to organize the PayPal mafia, which you see here, the other billionaires who had come out of the Silicon Valley, some of whom, like Musk and David Sachs, were also South African refugees, as they've now, the only refugee status that the United States recognizes at this point under their tutelage is white South Africans, are the only legitimate refugees in the world. But some of these were also white South African refugees, and they began to organize to fund various technological projects. Seasteading, as I mentioned, as a technological project, but also longevity research, artificial intelligence, and so forth. They also began to listen to marginal philosophers, if you can call them that. Mencius Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin has become much into the center of attention now, who argued explicitly that CEO monarchs should be the government of the future, that democracy was done and that we needed to adopt a corporatist, authoritarian, monarchical style of politics. They have now dominated military expenditures. Musk's SpaceX is an integral and inescapable part of US satellite communications and US space program. So they have found their way into being central pillars of the new military and technological state. The critics, some critics have dubbed them the Nerd Reich. They believe they can get less regulation and taxes from the populist fascist right, and that's really what they want as in the bottom line, as well as replacing the state with network states and CEO kings. Of course, the irony is that by being allied with anti-science populism, they are also destroying some of the very ideas that they came to power through. So the kinds of futurism that I have been promoting instead, as I said, it involves techno-optimism, but it also has to be critical of the quasi-religious ways that we have that our futurism, that our thinking about the future has been deformed by our biases, our religious views. When I got involved in futurism back as a teenager, I read a book from, it was actually a Soviet book on bourgeois futurism, but they pointed out how all of the people in Western futurism, Alvin Toffler and the other futurist writers of the 70s and 80s, how bourgeois they were, that they all were talking about how short next year's skirts would be, but they weren't talking about whether capitalism would face a crisis, because that's not something that anyone would pay them to talk about in the West. Versus left futurism, which is willing to talk about certain things and not about others. So trying to be more open-minded about our futurism. And this was a line in the Techno-Progressive Declaration. The world is unacceptably unequal and dangerous. Emerging technologies could make things dramatically better or worse. And this is, again, to the point. I am not Pollyanna. I think that emerging technologies could land us in a boot forever stomping on our face, as George Orwell said, or it could land us in a much more egalitarian and free world. And that is the challenge before us. We also said, unfortunately, too few people yet understand the dimensions of both the threats and rewards that humanity faces. It's time for techno-progressives, transhumanists, and futurists to step up our political engagement. And as I said, many of them went back and stepped up their political engagement in exactly the way that I thought we had just agreed not to, but they did. They tried it anyway, and hopefully now have learned a lesson that calling yourself a transhumanist doesn't tell anybody anything about the kind of politics that you advocate for. Our core commitment as techno-progressives is that both technological progress and democracy are required for the ongoing emancipation of humanity from its constraints. Technology could exacerbate inequality and catastrophic risks, but if democratized and well-regulated, it could also ensure longer, healthier, and more enabled lives. And I think this is the fundamental point, to steer between techno-determinism or techno-utopianism and Luddism. So the Luddites today will say things like, AI is just a scam. I think if you just interact with the LLMs, it's hard to come away with the conclusion that it's just a scam. There's something there. It may not be what they are selling us. It may be overpromised, but there is something there. Or they say, yeah, it works, but it should be banned because of resources or because of bias or because of chatbots. Okay, but those are things that can be fixed. We could use fewer resources. We could fix the bias. We could make the chatbots not drive you insane. In other words, they will, if they decide that it actually works, they'll say it works so well that it should be banned. And I don't think that that's the necessary conclusion. For me, I think the position that we're in today is that AI will probably erode employment. AI capitalists do overpromise and underdeliver. AI is used to discipline workers and monopolize resources. AI capitalists do support illegal fascist regimes, and AI does need regulation and possibly expropriation. And I think it will eventually lead to wealth needing to be redistributed through a universal basic income. I've advocated for universal basic income since the 70s, well before the contemporary automation debate began to give it more weight and more of a sense of inevitability. I think universal basic income, I started to adopt it when I read Andre Gortz, actually. Andre Gortz argued for universal basic income, late 70s, early 80s, French Marxist, on the grounds that the non-class of non-workers would eventually see this as the central demand as automation began to take over. So I think our evolution towards a post-work society is clearly a part of the vision of what a techno-progressive futurism should look like, that it is possible to liberate human beings from the need to sell their labor in order to exist. And I'm not, because I'm anti-communist and anti-Marxist-Leninist, I don't like the term fully automated luxury communism, but A lot of people use the term fully automated luxury communism, and I recognize that I'm just an old crotchety social democrat because so many kids call it small c communism today, and maybe that's what we'll call it in the future. But I would rather we called it something else, fully automated luxury socialism, but whatever. And I think there's a certain inevitability to that because of the generational inequity that of the gap between the growing numbers of senior citizens and the shrinking numbers of workers, which I'll get to in a second. The call for more life is clearly the most popular emerging technology political demand. And we have now things like Ozempic, the GLP-1 drugs, which it's just astonishing to me. Transhumanists, we've been talking for a long time about the need for drugs that will keep you alive longer and will extend life expectancy. Now they're here. They're called GLP-1 drugs. They not only keep you skinny and beautiful, but they increase your life expectancy and reduce cancer, heart disease, stroke. They also give you more self-control over your sexual behavior and your over drug abuse and substance abuse. They are a killer techno fix. And why transhumanists are not totally enthusiastic about universal access. The World Health Organization just yesterday issued a statement saying GLP-1s are so successful, everybody should have access to them. And we think it's a tragedy that only 10% of the obese people in the world have access to GLP-1s, and diabetes needs to be treated with these drugs, and we need to get them in everyone's hands. I agree. As a part of a general program of investment in technology to give people expanding basic funding for biomedical research so that we can eventually cure all the different causes and problems of aging. This is our most popular demand, our most popular political program, and should be a centerpiece of what we promote. But again, the techno-progressive point is, if we ask Americans, this is from a couple of years ago, but if we ask Americans, what would a future with radical life extension look like? 79% said everyone should be able to get treatments. I agree. And then 66% said, but we think only the wealthy are going to have access. And we think medical scientists will offer access to these things before we understand their health effects. And they're right. The rich do have differential access, and that is a tragedy and needs to be addressed. And medical science needs a clinical regulatory pathway to ensure that the things that we offer to the public are well tested and that we understand their side effects. So GLP-1s, gender tech. The fact that most transhumanists and most futurists and academic philosophers and so on are men between the ages of 20 and 60, cisgender, straight men, often. Maybe not disproportionately straight, I don't know. But at least not terribly interested so far in the politics of gender. And for me, transgender people are cyborg special forces. They're out there putting their lives on the line for the right to use technology to control their bodies, demanding that right. And where are the transhumanists? Who they should be at the front of the line defending people with transgender aspirations. And some, like Martine Rothblatt, who has written a book called Transgender to Transhuman, have made this argument explicitly. But no, most of the transhumanists aren't on board yet. So again, the one thing that even the right-wing transhumanists and we share is the insistence on our right to control our own bodies, our own brains, and our own reproduction. Individualism, the right to control our own lives. It goes back to John Stuart Mill, arguing that a society that maximally guarantees the right to determine your own affairs, as long as you don't interfere with other people's lives, that is the society that will produce the most happiness. And I think that we generally agree on that. And there are many organizations, many movements that advocate for those kinds of rights. And we address them explicitly in the Techno-Progressive Declaration. We talked about drug law reform, psychedelic and more broadly, psychoactive drug decriminalization, as a prelude to cognitive enhancement. If you don't have a right to take cannabis, then how are you going to get these other rights to take cognitive enhancement? Only in the medical context, really, usually. You have to get a diagnosis. You have to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order to get access to gender-affirming care. This, I think, is one of the regulatory questions we face. Who should have the right to take hormones? Who should have the right to control their own brain? Do you need a prescription from a doctor or not? So the techno-progressive intervention that we've been advocating for is not just to reach out to the social movements and say, look, you as a feminist need to think about the fact that we're advocating not only for contraception and abortion and reproductive health services, but one of the things that women will have the option of, and already have the option of, is to understand the contents of their womb, or to understand the genetic characteristics of their gametes and to change them if they want. Is this one of the rights we should be fighting for? One of the individual rights we should be fighting for, to control your own reproduction and what kinds of children you have? Unfortunately, if you're actually engaged in one of these movements, and this, I think, comes from my influence of rational choice Marxism, which asks, why would a worker ever join a workers' movement? What's in it for them to join a workers' movement? Well, the same question, I think, could be asked if you were concerned about transgender rights, or you're concerned about GLP-1 rights. Is there any interest at all in being associated with transhumanism, even though philosophically it may have something to do with what you're doing, but it's a controversial movement that's often seen as reactionary and is probably not going to help you to be associated with it? This I understand, because I grew up as a socialist in the United States. And that when we would go to Democratic politicians and say, we as socialists want to support you, what should we do? They would say, well, first, don't tell anyone that you're a socialist, because that will hurt me. And the same thing's probably true today still with techno-progressivism or transhumanism. We probably don't have much to contribute to social movements in that way yet, except to say, we support you. But with the futurists, with the philosophers, with the policy people, I think we have an avenue. We have a project of saying, look, the problems in this policy sphere are connected to the problems in this policy sphere. And if you're going to argue for this kind of technological intervention, you should probably be for this kind as well. Personhood rights, for instance. The whole point, the centerpiece of my book, Citizen Cyborg, was to argue that the rights of the fetus, the debated rights of the fetus around abortion, the rights of people around brain death, the rights of animals, and the rights of robots all shared a philosophical question of that we called non-anthropocentric, substrate-independent personhood ethics. And that mature persons, and also that the political consequence of that is, if you were determined to be a mature person, you should have certain citizenship rights. Now, great apes aren't yet mature persons, but what if they could be made mature persons? Should we be trying to work on that? What would their rights be if they could have a conversation with us and argue Kant with us? Not all animals and robots will be persons, and maybe we shouldn't want animals and robots to become fully enabled persons. Maybe it's too dangerous for robots to become persons in our society. But we have to have that debate, and we can't just have it by saying humans are magic and what they have, nobody else can have. I think that our regulation and our politics has to become transnational. I think one of the crises of social democracy has been that the capital short circuits any national project. And this is why I've been such a supporter of the European Union, but my time is running short, so I'll speed it up a little bit. We need to be preparing for the fights to come. There will be fights about emerging technologies. I think for me, 2008 was instructive that many of us were arguing that biopolitics was going to become this new cogent form of political identification in the 2000s. And then 2008, the global economic crisis, our continuing economic insecurity as a result of artificial intelligence and everything else that's happening in the world, brought the economic back to the fore. I'm not sure that anyone will ever say, well, I, as a liberal, have to work with this conservative because we agree about anti-aging. But the anti-aging issue is going to be a central part of our politics, and we do need to figure it out. The climate crisis. I've argued that techno-progressive approaches to the climate crisis are those that are not Luddite, and of course the Luddite or the techno-skepticism is very, very deep in ecological politics, but that there are people like Lee Phillips here in the US, he's actually Canadian, but he's been an articulator of what an ecological, a pro-Green New Deal politics would look like that accepted genetically modified organisms as a possible solution, that accepted nuclear power as a part of the picture, that accepts the possibility that we might need to intervene at a global level through geoengineering to slow down the warming of the planet. And this is my concluding set of thoughts. I've always been fascinated by theories of the new class, what it means to be a knowledge worker in our modern society, for our class identity and our class being a class in ourselves versus for ourselves. Gilas wrote this book, The New Class, about communist, which is kind of quasi-Trotskyist analysis of the deformation of the worker state under the control of the communist new class. Burnham was making similar observations about the convergence of Marxist-Leninist societies with Western capitalist societies because of the growth of the manager class. And then if you look back at history, liberal middle-class people have always had more interest in rights than peasants and industrial workers and others. And so there is a prehistory to the political divergence of the interests of the professional managerial class, as we've come to call it in the American left. But we also see that the professional managerial class has begun to converge politically. There is a huge split between that college-educated working class and the non-college educated working class. And the non-college educated working class has increasingly gravitated towards the right, as Piketty has demonstrated that part of our social democratic crisis is that college-educated workers have increasingly become focused on rights-based politics, but not sufficiently. Their parties, the social democratic parties, as they became reliant on these middle-class college-educated workers, began to de-emphasize redistribution and increasingly support the idea of meritocracy. You went to college, therefore you deserve to earn twice as much as a blue-collar worker. What's happening now is that we, the professional managerial class, are under threat economically. We're economically insecure, and we are beginning to support populist economic programs that could be the basis for the reconstitution of a social democratic majority. And I think you can see that in places like Zoran Mamdani's victory in New York City, where he had more support from the educated professional managerial class than he had from blue-collar people. And I think this is a portent of going forward. Briefly, I think there's also prospects for renewal of our interest in an ability to do planning, various kinds of economic planning, that artificial intelligence and algorithms point the direction towards fixing what used to be called the socialist calculation problem, that there are too many facts that a planned society would need to know, and markets are better at aggregating that information than planning is. And I think artificial intelligence may be an answer to that inadequacy. Not that we could go to a planned society overnight, but that increasing amounts of planning are enabled. Walmart, as again, Lee Phillips has argued, People's Republic of Walmart is an example of what a planned economy could look like. Within capitalism, the seeds of a new society are growing. They're being grown by capitalists. Gray tsunami, crashing fertility rates, growing life expectancy, means that eventually we are going to need to have a new political and economic order that redistributes the burdens so that it's not a shrinking number of working age adults paying taxes to support the pensions of a growing number of retirees. We probably are going to have something more like the Norwegian social sovereign wealth fund, collectivized ownership of our resources that then is used to create dividends to support a universal basic income. Digital democracy. I don't know if you clock the fact, but the interim prime minister in Nepal after the Gen Z revolution there was selected by a Discord server election. I don't know the details of it, but I think it's a portent of things to come. New forms of digital democracy that we should be exploring and experimenting with. I think some of the experiments have already been disappointing. You know, the 5-star movement in Italy, the Spanish socialist experiment with digital democracy. Neither one produced dramatic results, but I think that is probably the direction we need to go. So, okay, my last point here. In the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, we have started what we call the Techno-Progressive Policy Project. We're publishing and collecting essays along these lines about techno-progressive policy. I urge you to submit something 1,000 to 2,000 words, no citations necessary. Just tell us what you think should be done, what is to be done. We're going to have a conference in 2006 to discuss the various proposals and try to hammer out a platform for a nonprofit organization that we've tentatively called the Techno-Progressive Hub. And we want that Techno-Progressive Hub to begin to work from DC. This would be in DC, Washington, DC. We wanted to work with other progressive think tanks and parties and movements around the world. And in particular, I'm imagining the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung as being the kind of parameters of the politics of the kind of think tanky work we want to do around techno-progressive policy. So from billionaires and bourgeois futurists, the future needs to be liberated. And I think we can offer humanity much more profound emancipatory possibilities and accept that they will undermine the current social order, that we need new visions of what the social order should be. These possibilities will only be realized if we overcome the current system that allows billionaires to dictate our future direction. Billionaires to buy our platforms of communication and deform them with their biased algorithms. The techno-progressive left provides, I think, vital projects and visionary alternatives for social democrats and democratic socialists to build an equitable future. Thank you for your attention.